The following program is a production of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Herbert Kohl. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is Herb Kohl, who is the author of Archetype to Zeitgeist. Welcome, Herb.
Well, thank you very much.
With us today.
It's nice to be here.
Herbert Kohl is a teacher and a writer who is interested in educational change and economic justice. His earlier book, A View from the Oak, won the National Book Award for Children's Literature. Archetype to Zeitgeist is an unusual book. It's a dictionary, but
kind of like
it's
a dictionary,
not a dictionary
yes.
in a way too, because it gives a history as well as a definition, and also mainly because I guess it's not arranged in ordinary dictionary fashion, it's arranged by topic. How did you sell the idea of this book to a publisher?
Well, I really didn't sell it to them. I got a call from Little Brown, and they said they're doing reference books for high school students. Would I like to do one? And I said yes and no. I don't like the idea that there's books that are relevant to high school students and not to non-students or not to adults and all. I like to write in the simplest, clearest, most direct language I possibly can for anyone who cares to read. But I said I'd try anyway, and they said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, what I would like to do is a dictionary of ideas. My idea was that people do not speak well in our culture. People are inarticulate. They have not, that we're not accustomed to arguing issues. And I think part of the problem of not talking well about ideas leads us into being unable to solve major problems, social problems, economic problems, racial problems, personal problems, because language is a powerful tool. And so I just started talking to them about it, and they said, well, try. So I did, and I began to, but it came out of a lot of my own experience with teaching young people, with teaching adults, and with myself being extremely concerned about the poverty of public language in our culture.
So you didn't just start writing this book with that?
No, I think I started when I was about 10 years old, actually. When I was about 10, I grew up in the South Bronx, and what happened is in our neighborhood there used to be all these salespeople, peddlers and all, and some of the icemen would come with ice. I was literally in the late 30s, early 40s in New York. That's the way it was, and there was always an Encyclopedia Britannica salesman who would come around. And one knocked at the door of my house, and he came in. And I lived in a house with my grandparents and my parents and my uncles and my aunts. It was a real extended family, not a nuclear family like Bush and those people talk about, but a real larger family, a family that went through generations and across ages, And he said that if you bought the Encyclopedia Britannica, I remember he told my grandmother, who hardly spoke English, your son will go to college, or your grandson will go to college. And the funniest one was that he also said that if you bought the leather binding, your son would go to, grandson would go to Ivy League school,
a good
right?
college.
Yeah, a good college. And they did. And then they assigned me to read the Encyclopedia Britannica from A to Z, and I sat down and I started at A, and I didn't understand a word that I read. I was about 10, and then I went to a dictionary and I tried to look up the words that I didn't understand, and then the dictionary entry had defined the words in other words I didn't understand. And so finally I just gave up reading it, but instead I devised a strategy of looking at all the pictures from A to Z and reading all the captions. And it was wonderful because I learned all the different kinds of birds and what every piece of armor was like and all of those wonderful things that were illustrated. But I've to this day, I perhaps have never read through an Encyclopedia Britannica entry. Or maybe I have every once in a while. But at that point, it kind of occurred to me, why can't they do this in language I understand? Why, I mean, are these ideas so complex that I couldn't understand them if they just spoke directly to me? And in a sense, it's determined almost all of my writing. I've written and published over 30 books on education, on computers, on sociology, on social justice, on all kinds of things. And all of them, I basically write for the people I grew up with in the Bronx and for myself. That is to say, no matter how complex, there's no reason why we can't use the simplest possible language that is required in order to introduce these complex things. And the words I chose there are words that take you beyond ordinary language because they're necessary. They describe new ways of organizing experience, new ways of perceiving the world. And words get created because there's some experience that the language we had before can't quite convey. So there's a reason for these words. There's a purpose, there's a use. It's not just a matter of putting someone down or being chic or whatever, but it's a way of reorganizing our thought processes. And so what I decided to do was to choose words that themselves either confounded people and confused them or would extend their power, which is why I have that subtitle, Powerful Ideas for Powerful Thinking. I think I ultimately and fundamentally believe that language has a power to transform the world if used well and appropriately, and has behind it a good heart and a good spirit, you know.
Uh-huh. When you go into a bookstore, where would you find this book? Because it's not specifically a dictionary.
Well, it tends to be put now in reference books section. And you know, right now reference book sections can be everything from Portuguese dictionary to trivia to slang to dictionaries to other things. So a lot of times it's put in reference books, but a lot of my other books are in education. So sometimes depends on how many copies the bookstore buys, you might also find it in education. And you might find it in politics or sociology, because there's a lot of words there that are political or that come from sociology that are words that deal with the way in which people structure their lives and organize and dream of organizing the world. But I'd say primarily you find it in the reference section.
Okay. I have fondly called this my ABC book for adults.
That's what it is, yes.
So I was going to ask you how you would describe it.
Well, it really is it is an attempt to, I mean, I tried to organize it in 3 different ways. In the back of the book, it's all listed alphabetically as it would be in a dictionary.
Every librarian loves an index, so
and it's a
we
real,
thank you for that.
And not only that, but the index also has, for example, sometimes I try to define a cluster of words, so that, for example, I wanted to define bias, prejudice, racism and all as a block, as different levels of, and discrimination, different levels of trying to stigmatize other people. So if I would do that, then under any of them, like bias, it would be C, and then it would give you all the other words that were defined there. So that what I did was a lot of cross-referencing in the index too. So I tried to make it a very functional index. In fact, I had discussions with my publisher and they disagreed with me, so I lost, is that I wanted that to be at the beginning of the book rather than the end, because I thought of it as one possible real use is as a dictionary. The other way I did it was, but it's a dictionary of ideas, not attempt to be a comprehensive dictionary. The other way I organized it was by subject matter: sociology, literature, the arts, politics, the environment. And so that I clustered the words, and therefore in the way in which they're, numbered in the books, you can look at the beginning and see where those different sections are. Then the third strategy for organizing the book is to put all the words in boldface in a large margin with occasional illustrations so that you can peruse it. Because it's
as you did when you were 10.
That's right, exactly. And so the idea was you pick it up and you flip the page, and since they're not short definitions, but they're essays, I mean, they range from a paragraph to 4 pages in terms of the history, the nature, the use, the concept, the way in which the word can either empower or disempower you or somebody else. That the idea was that someone who just, as an adult, I know I love books that I can just pick up and look at random. so that I don't have to have a use for it, I don't have to read it, but it would enlighten me. The other thing that's funny is that I've found a lot of those, if you read the New York Times on Sunday, or if you read a magazine or a New York Review of Books or any one of a number of different journals, you'll come upon words that are used, and if you come upon it more than once and you don't really understand how it's used, I hope there's a good chance you'll find it in there in a way that would make sense to you. Then you could find out whether the author is just kind of hiding behind the screen of polysyllabic words or is saying something interesting.
Well, indeed, just for fun, I tried reading the section on psychology because I had a book on psychology that I was wanting to read, and it was kind of interesting to me that for me that chapter refined and sort of refreshed my knowledge, and it made the book more interesting to me.
Oh, how nice, thank you.
So that was, the other fun thing I did with the book was go through one section and just write down the words in boldface and see how many I could define with reasonable accuracy.
Well, you know, I did a lot of research, but I've been very lucky. Ever since my Encyclopedia Britannica story, I've collected dictionaries and collected reference books. So I have several hundred of them. And I do that perusing. I really love it. And when I was teaching elementary school, for example, one of my exercises with the kids was have the kids take a dictionary, open it at random, put their finger down, and that was the word they had to learn that day or that week.
Or
and
write we've done a thing, writing a poem. You have to pick out 4 words at random
That's
and
right.
write a poem using all 4.
But then, but that's right. But then I would love to then help the kids see how that word functioned in use. I mean, how it could be functional, how it could be used. And I think part of the real dilemma that I tried to deal with in the book is, for example, when you have the language of psychology, you can say, oh, psychoanalysis, or you can say this, or you can say that, but you want to know how these things go together. How you can take control of all of these. How does behaviorism relate to psychoanalysis, relate to the range and variety of psychotherapies? And that's what I tried to do, was to kind of put a larger vision to it.
So that there is sort of a whole when you look at a topic.
That's right. Yeah. And also, hopefully it's somewhat playful as well.
Yes, I think so. And it has wonderful paper, too.
Yes, it's real. Yeah, no, it's
a nice book.
It's a nice, yeah. It feels right.
A nice gift book.
Yes.
How did you decide what to include as well as what to exclude?
Well, what I had to do in terms of inclusion and exclusion was say, let's hope there's a second volume, because there are so many powerful words. But I did several things very concretely. I have 3 20-year-old children. There's not 20, they're in their 20s. 2 of whom graduated from university and 1 of whom is still there. So I asked them what words were current among their friends, the classes, what they expected. Now that's just a very trivial way to begin, but I needed some place to begin. What words were confounding them? What words and concepts did they wish they had? What were they expected to use in their response? Then I went, when I was teaching at Hamlin University here in St. Paul, and I did a survey among the seniors and said, what words and concepts would you wished you had known when you arrived that people expected you to know? And then I said to the faculty, and I did a faculty survey saying, what words would you have liked students to have known that you didn't think they knew adequately? So I got another several hundred words from there. Then I spent all the time reading New York Review of Books, all kinds of other things. And I sent out a survey to writers and to a whole bunch of other people whose business it is to analyze language, people who do propaganda analysis and all, and say, what is the operative vocabulary that you think is essential when people talk about sensitive issues, either to deceive people or to enlighten them? And so I ended up with a list of approximately 1,500 words, and I narrowed it down to 400 essential ones. And I would have done 1,500 if I had a larger advance and more time and energy. But since I was doing it all myself, I decided these had to be the core ones. And also the one thing I had to do is I dropped out words that specifically dealt with computer world, words that specifically dealt with science, because I thought of that as a separate volume. And so that got it down to these well, 400 definitions and approximately another 400 words defined within the definitions.
Well, that's interesting that you pulled from words to deceive, because as I think of a lot of these words, I think of them as being hard to wrap your mind around.
That's right.
And so that's probably symptomatic of deceptive words, too.
That's right. I mean, they're very slippery. It's like, I really found, for example, the other thing I did was analyze words that were being used by politicians to claim a position that they were and to insult people who they're running against them. Liberal is a perfect example. So-and-so is a liberal. And then people began to be afraid to say they were liberals. And so I said, well, look, what I have to have here is, or conservative. I have to look at the history of that word. I have to look at what it actually means. And so that if someone calls someone else a liberal, at least they should know what they're being called, you know? And then they can decide whether they are or they're not. Also, the difference between communism and socialism. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Europe, and the Europeans think that we're politically primitive in our vocabulary and in our options and our choices. And so I did a whole entry there, for example, on the political spectrum, in which I talked about how the center is placed according to the range of opinions and parties in a society. So that the center isn't a fixed point, but that the center of the political spectrum in a society has to do with where you place the possibility of ways of organizing things. And then I tried to go and do the whole range from anarchist to libertarian, through, you know, kind of socialist and conservative and liberal and social democrat and whatever. But my idea was not to say that one is better than the other, but to say, if you speak about these, know what you're talking about.
A very good section for people to read now as we speak, being just shortly before the '92 election.
That's absolutely right. In fact, it was the beginning of the primaries in '91 and '92, and this obsessively and obscenely perhaps long campaign in which language people had to use language differently because they were campaigning too long. And you know, they couldn't repeat themselves exactly, so they had to vary it somewhat. And I was looking for the difference between political discussion and discourse and personal attack. And what I'm concerned with is increasing the complexity and sophistication of political discussion, and hope that this personal attack thing, you know, becomes a matter for high school or junior high, or I mean, it becomes marginalized. You know, it's not something we need to put as center stage in our discussions.
Well, I was really reminded of this book when I heard the debates, I think the debate in which the real folks spoke, and the one man set the tone right away by saying, we don't want to hear any more of personal attacks and mudslinging. And they didn't talk about it anymore. It was sort of the power of the people.
It was like
speaking up.
Yes, you know, it was almost like seeing them take a deep breath and swallowing it and saying, what am I going to do now? Half of my vocabulary is gone. It's all disappeared. And it was such a relief. But you see, what's interesting is that there are some people who think that the personal, people who control the questioning, who control the debates for the candidates, that think that the personal will work. But most people that I talk to really are kind of sick of it. And that's why I feel that the book, in a sense, tries to meet, you know what it is? It's like, my grandmother never went to school. I don't think at all, nor did my grandfather, who I grew up with. My mother spent a couple of years in high school. My father graduated from college, but they were, all of them, were some of the smartest people that I've ever met. And I've never mistaken intelligence for schooling. And I think that one of the things that happens with a lot of these TV debates and all is to underestimate the intelligence of people and to play to, and not only play to, but to create a lowest denominator. Because I believe people really are intelligent, can use words, can discuss things. I tell you, my daughter, Erica, who was involved in social activism, spent a year in Scotland and Wales in poor communities where the industry had left and there was an attempt to rebuild the communities. And she said she'd go to Wales and she'd see the mining families, people who were, you know, working in the pits that were closing down and all. And she said the level of intellectual discussion that she heard among those people was at least was tantamount to, if not even more sophisticated than anything she encountered at Reed College, where at Reed the level of intellectual discourse is high, elevated, but not with the urgency of people whose lives are at stake.
Absolutely, and one of the questions in that same debate came from a woman who questioned one of the candidates on, you know, what has this meant to you personally, the lack of jobs and failure to pay your mortgage, etc. And it was clear that this bright, schooled, wealthy person did not understand her question.
Yes, and yet I would say that the woman who asked that question would be able to engage in all kinds of conversation and would be more interested, because I noticed she was struggling with language.
Yes.
Is that she needed to have an opportunity and an occasion in language that she would understand to acquire some of the other concepts that would be more useful to her to analyze.
She was struggling with the language of the politicians and to incorporate that in what she needed to
but also the language of reflection. I think one of the most important things that we need to do is to help people reflect on their experience. It's one thing to have experience, but it's another thing to reflect on it and to take some control over it because you've managed to organize it, understand it. For example, just the sense of, why am I poor? That itself is probably one of the most complex questions that you can raise. And you have to have language, you have to analyze things, and you can't just, otherwise, you know what you do is you blame the wrong person or you blame yourself.
Even worse, yes.
Yes, so that's why I meant powerful ideas, to think in ways that will get you more power over the conditions of your own life.
So in a way you've answered my next thought, which is, who will find this book useful?
I hope anybody who can read seriously and who cares about language and who wants to speak and wants to, first of all, listen in ways that they understand what people are saying. They want to know whether they're being fooled or whether they're being enlightened. They want to know whether language is being used as a mist, you know, to disguise a lack of substance, or whether it's being used in ways that will let you know where someone stands or how they think. I think it also is for somebody who really wants to read widely and not be intimidated by the language of the academy. I mean, a lot of people who are very, very intelligent get afraid when people use words they don't know. Mm-hmm. And this is an attempt to demystify a lot of the language that people would encounter when they try to read about serious issues in ways that are perhaps in many cases necessarily complex, in some cases overly complex. But I think it really is an attempt to say, look, ordinary people are brilliant, are wonderful. And that therefore, but sometimes you need a tool to help you decipher things, you know. If you're going to build a house, it's better to have a hammer and a saw, and it's better to have an electric saw than a hand saw sometimes. And this is, in a sense, a tool which is not a replacement for a dictionary, because certainly you should have a good dictionary, but it's a supplement in the sense of saying it will take some powerful language that you will encounter all the time and maybe give you closer access to it so you can use it and feel comfortable with it.
You've written, as I look over your many books, all of your books really deal with education for people at various stages in their growth, so it's obvious that you've been interested all your life in some aspect of education. So why this book at this particular time?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I believe my wife told me that she thought that my whole career, I've taught from kindergarten through graduate school, and not in that order, because I think that the hardest work I've ever done is teaching kindergarten and first grade. And in fact, I taught kindergarten, first grade again when I was 50 just to see if I could handle it. I did very well. I lost 25 pounds, you know, and I mean, it was wonderful, marvelous, difficult work. But I've been doing a lot of, my writing has to do with my teaching. My teaching has a lot to do with the ages of my own children. and I've always been very close, not only to my own children, but to their friends. We've kind of had an open house to a lot of young people, and so this is an issue that they brought to me, you might say, that they put on the table. And so at this stage in my writing, I'm working on a new book which I'm having a very difficult time with, which has been brought to me by some young students I'm working with, some 7 to 10-year-olds. But this was brought to me by young people who are in or just out of college, who was struggling with all of this language, and then by my parents and my wife's parents, who were trying to figure out what these people are talking about now in public discourse, being very intelligent people, but still finding that the language was used to kind of twist them a little bit. So that's why that book was done. The one I'm trying to work on now that I'm having such a hard time is hope, violence, and childhood. And I've seen children these days who have no hope. And this cuts across class, by the way. I mean, a lot of very poor children growing up in communities that are defined by the violence and that physical violence that they have no hope.
And college kids who have no hope.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. But it also is among the middle class and the younger brothers and sisters of college kids who see their brothers and sisters going to college and telling them, so what? Because I'm not going to get a job. And so I'm trying to provide. So I think one of the perverse things I try to do with all of my writing is provide hope and some romantic vision of possibility in the face of what seems like an impossible task. And I've been doing it for 30 years, so I see no reason to abandon it, you know. But it really is an attempt to affirm faith in the presence of the current psychological, political, social, and economic violence in our culture. But I've been having a very difficult time doing it. And so it's nice to be able to write lots of other books while I'm figuring out how to be optimistic when I shouldn't be, you know.
Well, speaking of impossible tasks, I understand that you are working on a project to improve the high schools in New York City.
Yes, not so impossible. You know, young people are wonderful. And even people, and I guess I'm just giving, that's why I'm writing this book on hope, is that given an appropriate situation, given a sufficiently humane, caring environment, even people who have been very, very damaged by hard and harsh living in uncaring institutions will come alive again. I mean, I believe that as an article of faith. So even if I can't prove it, I won't abandon it, you know. And that's why William Bennett, the guy who solved the drug problem in America, called me an incurable romantic, and I thanked him. But I think he meant it as an insult. Anyway.
I think he did
yes,
too.
I'm sure he did. But see, since I know what the word means, I could thank him. That's right. Well, and I also could thank him. But is that what we're trying to do is provide small environments in the high school where every student can know every teacher can know every student, and where the community, the students and the teachers can create a character, a caring character for that institution, for that school, and really help each of the kids in their passage out of school, out of high school, into a larger world, develop. There are going to be 30 new high schools in New York City next year.
Wow.
Of this sort. There already are 23, and I'm just part of I'm a small part of a group of very, very caring people who are younger people who are just new to education, people who are veterans of 30, 40 years of struggles to create decent schools. And it's quite wonderful because in the face of the impossible, a lot of people come up to the challenge. And I think that there's some wonderful high schools in New York, but they're all small. Or there are large buildings broken down into small units. There's no reason why we can't do it. And besides, the choice would be between that and turning in your teacher's license and getting a badge. And it's better to teach.
Indeed. And I wish we had more time.
And thank you.
To finish this, but it's been very pleasant to have you. Thank you.
It's been very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
presentation of the Hennepin County Library.